The United States military has about 750 bases overseas, across 80 countries and colonies. That means that about 4 out of every 10 countries have US bases on them, across every continent except Antarctica. But having that many military bases abroad is normal, right?
This is more foreign military bases than any country or people or empire in world history.
In fact, only about a dozen other countries even have foreign military bases, with just 70 combined between them. That means the US has the other 90%. So why is that? And what would the world look like if the US shut its overseas military bases down? Military bases as we know them today really began popping up during World War II, following the 1940 Destroyers for Bases deal between the US and the UK. Under this deal, the US gave Great Britain 50 World War I naval vessels, known as destroyers, in exchange for 99-year leases and pretty much sovereign power over 8 British bases in the Western Hemisphere. These included Jamaica, the Bahamas, and Trinidad. By 1945, the US was building about 112 foreign bases a month. In the span of only 5 years, the US grew the first empire of bases in the world. This empire of bases strategy hasn't changed since World War II.
It was this moment that we see the United States become a new and unprecedented kind of empire, and was indeed a sign of the transferring of imperial power from the British Empire to the US Empire.
Meet David Vine. He's a professor of anthropology at American University. He literally wrote the book about military bases abroad. Over the years, he's been researching and compiling a detailed database of all the US bases around the world. His database is so extensive that a few years ago, one of the Pentagon's research groups used his list for reference for their research instead of their own.
The fact that researchers working for the Army needed to rely on my list of foreign bases that I've been putting together since 2015 is a really bad sign. It's a bad sign about transparency, but many researchers believe the Pentagon itself, the military itself, they don't know how many bases they have around the world because there's so many damn bases.
That brings us to the question at the heart of all this.
So what's the purpose of this military presence around the globe? It's a great question. In short, I think empire is part of the answer.
And that's why you can't talk about how many bases the United States has without talking about what those bases actually represent. US imperialism. While it's true that US military bases expanded dramatically after World War II, the US actually started exerting its power and influence outside its borders in the early 1800s. In 1823, the United States adopted a cornerstone of its foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine. This policy opposed European colonization and established the Western Hemisphere as the US's own sphere of influence. This helped lay the groundwork for the US to develop a taste for militarily intervening and invading, like intervening in the Cuban War of Independence in 1898 and occupying Spanish colonies, or engaging in a war with the Filipino revolutionaries just a year after that. Now obviously the US didn't stop there. After World War II, the American government both expanded military bases and established itself as a dominant power with the self-proclaimed right to militarily intervene across the globe. It sent troops to occupy Southern Korea in 1945, with the Vietnam War kicking off in 1955. The US kept deploying its military anywhere it felt threatened, often by left-leaning governments. Latin America is an example of this. The region experienced American interventionism and involvement in regime change multiple times. By the end of the Cold War, there were 1,600 US military bases in 40 countries and colonies. Today, the number of military bases is half that, but the number of countries and colonies that host these bases have doubled. Japan and Germany still have 119 US bases. South Korea has 76. It's important to note, included in these 750 bases outside the US are US territories where citizens don't have the same rights as mainland US citizens, like Guam, Puerto Rico, and American Samoa.
We can think of these bases as kinds of colonies. These are sort of mini micro colonies from which the US government and to a certain extent US corporations can exert power in the world.
You're looking at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Large bases like Ramstein are often referred to as Little Americas. Ramstein has American schools, apartment complexes, American fast food restaurants like Popeyes and Taco Bell, and many other American products. Over 400 overseas U.S. bases are large bases with more than 200 military personnel. The rest are small bases, or lily pads, that usually hold drones, surveillance aircraft, or pre-positioned weaponry and supplies. These are largely found in Africa, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. Professor Vine argues U.S. foreign bases are simply launch pads for war, like this drone site in Niger, this airstrip in the Galapagos Islands, and this base in Djibouti, which is used to launch airstrikes in Somalia. This strategy of exerting power comes at a cost. Since 2001, the US has spent close to $6 trillion on wars. To put this spending in perspective, it could have housed the entire homeless population in the US and ended world hunger. And it's not just financially costly. Over 800,000 people have died due to post-9/11 wars in the Middle East.
It needs to be dismantled. We need to dismantle the system of war, and we need to dismantle the power of the military-industrial complex. And unless we do, we are in deep, deep trouble, because I most of all fear the United States will end up in even more catastrophic wars than the catastrophic wars that we have been waging since 2001.
This brings up the looming possibility of a new war with China over Taiwan. US troops have been secretly training military forces in Taiwan, even though the US formally recognizes Taiwan as part of China.
Future wars should be simply unthinkable for our nation. There is widespread belief that anything the US military does in the world must be good and must be protecting the United States and protecting people around the world. And unfortunately, the opposite has all too frequently been the case.
And that is part of a bigger problem. US foreign bases have displaced millions of people. For example, Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia is a US base in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The US government conspired with the UK to illegally remove the entire local population in order to build the base. On top of that, many people in other host countries have consistently protested the presence of the US military. In Shannon, Ireland, residents have been protesting to halt the US military's use of Shannon Airport to transport arms. In 2009, the president of Ecuador refused to renew the license for a US base, stating the US military had too much control in his country.
Mire, si quiere, yo lo renuevo con una condición, que me permitan poner una base militar ecuatoriana aquí en Nueva York. No hay ningún problema en tener bases extranjeras, entonces vamos a llegar a un acuerdo.
Now, contrary to what the Pentagon portrays, closing overseas bases is relatively easy, because Congress doesn't need to be involved in the closures. Previous presidents have done it. Both Bushes and Bill Clinton closed hundreds of bases in Europe and Asia in the 90s and 2000s. This means the Biden administration could easily close hundreds of unnecessary military bases abroad, if it wanted to, that is. But it's not just a matter of closing a few bases, it's about questioning the role the United States plays in global politics, and how it uses its military force to get what it wants.
I think the world would be more peaceful, and I think the US people would be more secure if the United States had fewer military bases abroad. And after 20 years of disastrous warfare, this is a state of affairs that really should bring us all deep, deep pause and fundamental transformation in our approach to engaging with the rest of the world.